on a mild afternoon in Seoul. The kind of day where the sun felt just warm enough to keep the cool breeze at bay, outside a quiet cafe in Gangnam. A man sat at one of the outdoor tables, wearing sunglasses that partially shielded his face. He was unmistakable, Kim Seokjin, the global superstar and member of BTS. Though years had softened the sharpness of his features, his aura was undeniable. Passers-by occasionally glanced his way, unsure if they should interrupt the idol's moment of solitude. Across the street, another man stood unnoticed by most. His clothes were worn and layered, each piece telling a story of days spent in the elements. His hair was disheveled, and he clutched a small cardboard sign in one hand while his other fidgeted nervously in his pocket. His name was Min Jae, and today marked his third week sleeping near the Han River. Min Jae hadn't eaten a full meal in 2 days, his stomach gnawing at him, a relentless reminder of how far he'd fallen. As he scanned the cafe for someone who looked approachable, his eyes locked on Kim Seokjin. At first, he hesitated. What could a man like that possibly care about someone like him? But hunger has a way of eroding pride. Taking a deep breath, Min Jae crossed the street, each step heavier than the last. His voice was almost inaudible as he approached the idol's table. "Sir, can you spare $1?" Seokjin looked up slowly, removing his sunglasses. His expression was unreadable, and for a moment, Min Jae wondered if he'd made a mistake. But then Seokjin leaned back in his chair, studying Min Jae as if trying to piece together a puzzle. The seconds stretched on, and Min Jae's anxiety grew. He was ready to apologize and walk away when Seokjin finally spoke. $1, huh?" he said, his tone neutral. Then, with a hint of a smile, he added, "Sit down. Let's talk." Min Jae hesitated. The invitation felt surreal, almost like a scene out of one of those variety shows he used to watch when life was simpler. "Sit down with Kim Seokjin?" He scanned the idol's face for a sign that this wasn't a cruel joke, but there was no malice there. Just a calm curiosity that made him feel both exposed and oddly comforted. With a quiet "thank you," Min Jae eased into the chair across from Seokjin. His hands trembled slightly as he placed the cardboard sign on the table, angling it so it wouldn't catch too much attention. He could feel the weight of Seokjin's gaze, but it wasn't judgmental. It was curious, like someone who wanted to know the story behind the layers of dirt and despair. Min Jae wasn't used to this. Most people avoided eye contact or threw him loose change without a second thought. Nobody wanted to hear his story anymore. But sitting here, under the steady gaze of someone he never imagined meeting, the words started to spill out before he could stop them. I'm sorry if I bothered you," Min Jae stammered, his voice raw. I don't like asking. I've been trying to find work, but it's hard. Harder than I thought it'd be." He glanced down at his hands, ashamed of how desperate he sounded. Seokjin didn't interrupt. He just listened, which was more than most had done in years. Min Jae took a deep breath and continued, the dam breaking. "I was a delivery driver, had a steady job, a scooter, everything. Then the economy took a hit, and the jobs dried up. It didn't take long for the savings to run out. Then came the late notices, and after that," he paused, swallowing hard. "Well, you can guess the rest." He tried to laugh, but it came out bitter and hollow. "Funny, right? I spent my whole life delivering to people's doors, and now I can't even keep a roof over my own head." Seokjin's face remained calm, but his eyes softened. Min Jae could feel the shame creeping in again, and he tried to steer the conversation away from himself. "I know you probably get asked for things all the time. I don't mean to be another guy with a handout. I don't know what else to do anymore." But Seokjin wasn't the kind of man to brush off a story like that. He had a response Min Jae never saw coming. Seokjin leaned forward, resting his elbows on the table, his hands clasped loosely. The air between them felt heavier, quieter, as if the world had slowed down just for this conversation. Min Jae could feel his pulse quicken. He half expected Seokjin to hand him a couple of bucks and politely dismiss him, as others had done before. But instead, Seokjin asked a question Min-jae wasn't prepared for. "What's your name?" Min-jae blinked, caught off guard by the simplicity of the question. "Ah, Min-jae," he muttered, his voice barely above a whisper. Seokjin nodded slowly, letting the name settle. "Min-jae," he repeated, as if testing how it felt on his tongue. Then, after a pause, he said, "You know, Min-jae, I've been on stage in front of millions, sung songs that people say changed their lives. But one thing I've learned is that every person has a story. Good, bad, ugly. It doesn't matter. What matters is how they choose to carry it. So, tell me this. What's the next chapter of your story?" Min-jae stared at Seokjin, unsure if he was serious. "The next chapter?" he echoed, his voice tinged with disbelief. "Yes," Seokjin said, leaning back. "You're still here, aren't you? Breathing, talking, asking for $1. That means your story isn't over yet. So, what's the next chapter?" Min-jae felt a lump rise in his throat. He didn't have an answer. The truth was, he hadn't thought that far ahead in a long time. Survival didn't leave much room for long-term planning. "I don't know," Min-jae admitted finally. "I guess I just want to make it through the day." Seokjin's eyes narrowed, not in anger but in thought. "That's not a chapter, Min-jae. That's a sentence. You need a chapter, a real one, something you can build on." Min-jae felt an odd mix of frustration and curiosity. He wanted to ask Seokjin what he knew about struggle, but he held his tongue. There was something about the way Seokjin spoke, like he wasn't just throwing out cliches, but genuinely wanted Min-jae to think. Seokjin reached into his pocket, pulling out his wallet. Min-jae's heart sank. This was the part where the $1 would come out, and Seokjin would send him on his way. But Seokjin didn't pull out cash. Instead, he pulled out a business card and slid it across the table. "Go here," Seokjin said, his tone firm but not unkind. "It's a shelter run by a friend of mine. They'll help you get cleaned up, find a job, maybe even a place to stay. But it's up to you to take the first step." Min-jae stared at the card, his hands trembling. Why are you doing this?" he asked, his voice cracking. Seokjin's expression softened just a fraction. "Because someone did it for me once, and I wouldn't be sitting here if they hadn't." But Min-jae wasn't sure if he could believe in second chances. Not after everything he'd been through. Min-jae's fingers hovered over the business card as if it were made of glass, fragile and full of promise. He wasn't sure he deserved it. The name and address printed on it felt like a lifeline, but the weight of his doubts pulled at him. Could he really trust this? Could he trust Seokjin? "I don't know, man," Min-jae said after a long silence, shaking his head. "I've tried places like that before. They don't really help people like me." Seokjin's gaze didn't waver. "People like you? What does that even mean?" Min-jae swallowed hard, avoiding eye contact. "You wouldn't get it. Guys like me, we're just forgotten." Seokjin leaned forward again, his voice quiet but firm. "You think I've never been down? You think I don't know what it's like to feel like you're carrying the weight of the world and no one's there to help you lift it?" Min-jae looked up, startled. Seokjin's face, though calm, carried the weight of his words. "I've been in the spotlight for years, Min-jae. But before that, I was just a kid from Gwacheon, dreaming of something bigger. I know what it's like to feel invisible, to wonder if anyone even sees you. And let me tell you something, it's not about how hard you fall. It's about whether you're willing to get back up, even when the odds are stacked against you." The words hit Min-jae harder than he expected. He opened his mouth to argue, but found he had nothing to say. Seokjin leaned back, his tone softening. "Look, I'm not going to sit here and pretend I have all the answers. But what I do know is this. Life isn't fair, and it never will be. The only thing you can do is decide whether you're going to let that break you or build you." Min-jae felt tears prick the corners of his eyes, but he quickly blinked them away. "It's not that simple," he said, his voice cracking. "No, it's not," Seokjin agreed. "But simple doesn't mean easy. It's hard as hell. But if you don't try, you'll never know what could have been." Min-jae stared at the card again, his mind racing. He thought about the nights he'd spent on cold concrete, the meals he'd scavenged from dumpsters, the faces that turned away from him every day. And now, here was this man, a stranger, a global icon, telling him he was worth more than all of that. For the first time in years, Min Jae felt a spark of something he couldn't quite name. Hope, maybe. Or maybe it was just the realization that he had nothing left to lose. "I'll think about it," Min Jae said finally, his voice barely above a whisper. Seokjin nodded, as if that was enough. "Good? That's all I'm asking." But Min Jae wasn't the only one affected by this encounter. Seokjin had his own reasons for stepping in, reasons that would soon come to light. Min Jae clutched the business card tightly as he stood to leave, unsure of what to say or how to feel. Seokjin's words echoed in his mind, stirring up memories he'd buried long ago, of better days, of dreams that once felt achievable. As he took a few hesitant steps away, he turned back. "Thanks for listening," he said awkwardly, his voice barely carrying over the hum of the street. Seokjin gave a small nod, his expression unreadable. "Take care of yourself, Min Jae," he said simply, before slipping his sunglasses back on and returning to his coffee. But Min Jae didn't see Seokjin's hand falter slightly as he picked up the cup. He didn't notice the way Seokjin's jaw tightened for a brief moment, as if holding back a flood of emotion. Sitting alone again, Seokjin let out a slow breath, staring at the empty chair where Min Jae had been just moments before. It wasn't the first time he'd been reminded of his past, but it hit harder this time. He'd been younger than Min Jae when he'd first learned how quickly life could knock you down. Growing up in Gwacheon, Seokjin had watched his family struggle to make ends meet. There were nights when all they had was a simple meal of rice and kimchi to share. And then there were the strangers, neighbors, teachers, sometimes complete nobodies, who had stepped in with small acts of kindness that made all the difference. He remembered one teacher in particular, who had encouraged him to pursue music, even when it seemed impossible. That teacher had seen potential in a shy kid that no one else did, and it had changed the course of Seokjin's life. Now, years later, Seokjin carried that lesson with him. He'd built a career that most people could only dream of, but he'd never forgotten where he came from or the people who helped him get there. For Seokjin, helping Min Jae wasn't about charity. It was about giving someone else the chance he'd once been given. He knew the road ahead wouldn't be easy for Min Jae, but he also knew that sometimes all it took was one person believing in you to spark something bigger. Meanwhile, Min Jae walked aimlessly through the streets of Seoul, the card still clenched in his hand. He passed by shop windows where his reflection stared back at him, tired, worn, and defeated. But for the first time in a long while, he felt a flicker of something new. He stopped outside a laundromat, staring at the flickering neon sign. With the little money he had left, he decided to wash his clothes. If he was going to show up at that shelter Seokjin had mentioned, he wanted to look presentable. It wasn't much, but it was a step. And that first step would be the hardest, and the most important. One Min Jae had taken in years. That Minji's first visit to the shelter was overwhelming. The fluorescent lights, the sound of hurried footsteps, and the steady buzz of voices made him feel out of place. But the staff was kind. They didn't judge him for the state he was in, and for the first time in years, Min Jae felt like someone actually saw him. Not as a problem, but as a person. Days turned into weeks, and though the road wasn't smooth, Min Jae began piecing his life back together. The shelter helped him secure a temporary job at a nearby convenience store, where he quickly proved himself to be reliable and hardworking. With the money he earned, he moved into a modest shared apartment. It wasn't much, but it was a roof over his head and a step towards stability. Through it all, he thought about Kim Seokjin. He'd kept the business card, now worn and creased, as a reminder of the moment that changed everything. One night, after a particularly long shift, Min Jae sat down and wrote Seokjin a letter. He thanked him for the kindness he'd shown that day at the cafe and told him about the progress he'd made. Min Jae didn't expect a response, but writing the letter felt like closure, a way to acknowledge the man who had given him a second chance. Months later, Seokjin received the letter. Sitting in his quiet studio, he read it carefully, a faint smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. He folded the letter neatly and placed it in a drawer where he kept other mementos from his life. For Seokjin, it was never about recognition or gratitude. It was about paying forward the compassion he'd been shown when he needed it most. That Minji's story didn't end there. Inspired by his own journey, he started volunteering at the same shelter that had helped him. He spoke with others who were struggling, sharing his story and offering them the same encouragement Seokjin had given him. Slowly but surely, he became a symbol of resilience and hope within his community. The cafe in Gangnam remained a quiet backdrop for countless passers-by, unaware of the life-changing conversation that had taken place there. But for Minjae and Seokjin, it would always be more than just a meeting. It was a moment that proved the power of human connection, a simple gesture that rippled outward in ways neither of them could have predicted. And for those who hear their story, it serves as a reminder. Sometimes, the smallest acts of kindness can lead to the greatest transformations.